All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty vital in healthcare, something we all rely on but rarely think about. It's all that medical equipment, the machines and tools that keep hospitals running.
Yeah, that's right. The stuff we take for granted. Everything from those big MRI machines to the little monitors beeping away at your bedside. It's a whole world of technology that's crucial for diagnosis, treatment, you name it.
Exactly. And we're going to dig deep into how hospitals handle all this equipment. How do they make sure they have the right stuff? How do they keep it in good working order? And, how do they do all this without, breaking the bank?
Big questions. And we've got some fascinating sources to help us answer them. We'll be looking at specific guidelines used by ESIC hospitals in India. That's the Employees State Insurance Corporation. Plus, we've got our eyes on broader best practices for buying and managing medical equipment in hospitals globally.
So think of this as a journey. We're going to follow the life cycle of medical equipment in a hospital from the moment it's just an idea for a purchase all the way to, when it's time to retire the old machine.
We're talking about acquisition strategies, inventory management, maintenance protocols, and even the procedures for saying goodbye to outdated technology. Might not sound super exciting at first glance.
Well, not as exciting as, say, a new surgical robot.
True, but trust me, efficient medical equipment management, it has a massive impact on patient care. It also affects a hospital's financial health and even their environmental footprint.
Yeah, okay. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. So let's really break down why this whole area of medical equipment management is so important. What happens if a hospital doesn't get this right? What are the consequences?
Well, when a hospital nails its equipment management, it really shows. They're getting the most bang for their buck, avoiding overspending and making sure they have enough funds for other essential stuff. Plus, they're making sure that expensive equipment isn't just gathering dust, but is actually being used to, help patients.
Makes sense. I guess that's what they mean by optimal utilization.
Right. And keeping up with maintenance, that's essential to prevent those uh-oh moments when a machine decides to quit mid-procedure.
That would be a bad day for everyone involved.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of replacing outdated or potentially unsafe equipment. You got to protect both patients and staff.
Right. So it's not just about buying a bunch of fancy machines. It's about being strategic, efficient, and responsible.
Exactly. And that's where the ESIC equipment manual comes in. It's all about making sure the medical equipment is safe, efficient, and actually does what it's supposed to do and does it reliably and, making sure it lasts as long as possible.
For the benefit of everyone, the patients, the staff, the whole system.
Precisely. This manual, it's like a blueprint for achieving those goals.
Okay, let's talk shopping. What are some smart strategies hospitals use when they're looking to buy new equipment?
Well, the ESIC manual emphasizes the good old 5 R's of procurement. These are like the golden rules.
Hit me with them.
Right quality, right quantity, right price, right time and place, and finally, the right source.
The 5 R's, I like it. Easy to remember and important, obviously,
Yeah.
because you miss one of these and you could end up with the wrong equipment or way too much of it or paying way too much for it.
Exactly. And that could really impact patient care, right?
No doubt. So how does all this work in the ESIC hospitals?
Well, they try to be flexible and responsive to the needs of each individual hospital. So deans and medical superintendents, they actually have the authority to buy equipment, up to a certain limit, of course.
Oh, that makes sense. So they can get what they need quickly without waiting for a bunch of approvals.
Right. But of course, there are still rules and guidelines to make sure everyone's spending responsibly and, getting a good deal.
And that's where this government e-marketplace comes in, right? The GEM, as they call it.
Bingo. The ESIC manual and broader government rules, they really push using GEM for buying common goods and services.
So it's like a government version of Amazon for hospitals?
You could say that. It's all about transparency, making sure things are above board, and that you get competitive prices.
So less chance of shady deals and more bang for the taxpayer's buck. Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this GEM thing actually work? What are the rules of the game?
Well, they've got different rules depending on how much money you're spending. If it's a small purchase, like under 25,000 rupees, you can just go ahead and buy directly from a supplier on GEM.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, as long as they meet the quality and delivery requirements, of course.
Yeah.
But then when you get to purchases between 25,000 and 500,000 rupees, things get a bit more interesting.
More interesting how?
You got to pick the seller offering the lowest price. But here's the catch you need to get quotes from at least 3 different manufacturers.
So even for these smaller amounts, there's this element of competition.
Exactly. And get this, the manual even encourages using online bidding or reverse auction tools whenever possible.
Really? So, like, going all in on getting the best price, even for a relatively small purchase.
That's the idea. They're really trying to instill a culture of, smart spending.
Okay, what about the big ticket items, the stuff that costs more than 500,000 rupees?
For those big purchases, online bidding or reverse auction on Gem, it's not a suggestion anymore. It's mandatory.
No more cutting corners.
Nope. For these big deals, you got to use the platform to get those competitive bids. And here's the kicker. If a hospital decides not to use online bidding or reverse auction for these high-value purchases,
They better have a good excuse.
they do. They got to provide a detailed justification in writing and keep it on record. No getting around that.
Smart. Keeps everything transparent and accountable. So, no sneaky workarounds for those fancy new machines, huh?
Nope. And there are a couple more rules to keep in mind when using GEM. First, no splitting up a big purchase into smaller ones just to avoid those stricter GEM procedures.
So, no trying to game the system.
Exactly. And second, all ESIC institutions, they got to publish their annual procurement plans on the GEM portal. This is like their shopping list for the year, basically.
Makes sense. Everyone knows what's coming up, suppliers can get ready, and the whole process is more transparent.
That's the goal. And they've got these nifty business analytics tools on GEM, too.
What are those for?
Think of it like having a superpowered shopping advisor. These tools, they help the hospitals make smart decisions about pricing. They can analyze past data, compare prices from different sellers, and even look at their own purchase history.
So it's not just about blindly going for the cheapest option. It's about making informed decisions based on data.
Exactly. Data-driven procurement. That's the way to go.
Sounds pretty sophisticated. And speaking of sophisticated, the E6 system has all these committees dedicated to different parts of the procurement process. Can you walk me through who does what?
Of course. First up, we've got the Technical Specification and Cost Estimation Committee. Quite a mouthful, I know.
They sound important.
Oh, they are.
Mm.
They basically decide exactly what kind of equipment the hospital needs. They lay out all the technical details, the bells and whistles, the whole 9 yards.
So like creating a very detailed wish list.
Yes. And on top of that, they figure out how much this wish list is going to cost. They look at past purchases, do some market research, to come up with a realistic number.
Smart. Got to keep things grounded in reality.
Absolutely. And here's another crucial thing. They got to make sure all those specs and cost estimates follow all the relevant government guidelines.
Oh, so there's a layer of rules they have to navigate.
You bet. We're talking General Financial Rules, or GFR for short, directives from the Central Vigilance Commission, or CVC, the GEM procedures, and then there's the Make in India policy.
Make in India? That's the one that encourages buying stuff made in India, right?
That's the one. And they even include specific Make in India certifications in the specs to ensure the equipment is up to snuff. And for bigger purchases, they insist on on-site warranties and those comprehensive maintenance contracts, CMCs.
Got to make sure those machines stay in tip-top shape. So a lot of boxes to tick for this committee.
Yeah, they've got their work cut out for them. And the interesting thing is the more expensive the equipment, the more senior and specialized the members of this committee are.
Makes sense. You want the big guns handling the big purchases. So what happens next? Who takes over after the specs and costs are all sorted out?
Well, then it's time for the GEM Bid Creation Committee to step into the spotlight. As you might guess, they're the ones who actually create those bid documents for when the hospital needs to go through a competitive process.
So they're the ones who put the call out for all those eager suppliers.
Exactly. And just like the previous committee, the folks on this one also change depending on how much money is involved. Higher value purchase, more experienced committee members. Makes sense, right?
Absolutely. So after the bids are all shiny and ready, what happens next?
Time for the bid opening committee to do their thing. They've got a pretty straightforward but crucial job.
Let me guess they open the bids.
You got it.
Right.
And they make sure everything is properly documented, no funny business going on. And guess what? This committee has the same people as the bid creation committee.
Smart move. They already know the ins and outs of the bid, so it ensures consistency.
Exactly. No room for confusion or misinterpretations.
So the bids are open, everyone's holding their breath. What's the next step in this procurement roller coaster?
Now it's the Technical Evaluation Committee's turn to shine. They get down to business, scrutinizing those bids against those predefined tech specs we talked about. And sometimes they even make the companies do a live demo of their equipment, to make sure it actually works as promised.
Very hands-on. Got to make sure those machines can walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Exactly. And just like before, the bigger the purchase, the more experience you need on this committee.
So it's all about matching the expertise to the task at hand.
Precisely. Now, once the tech evaluation is done, it's time for the grand finale, the price bid opening and rate finalization committee.
The moment of truth.
They open the financial bids, but only for those companies that pass the tech tests, of course. Their job is to make sure those prices make sense and then recommend who gets the contract.
So they're the ones who make sure the hospital isn't getting ripped off.
You could say that. They also make sure that the price covers everything, all costs, including the GST, and for the really big purchases, anything over 2 crore rupees.
That's a lot of zeros.
It is. For those big deals, ESIC headquarters steps in to oversee the final price negotiations and give their stamp of approval.
So it's a whole system of checks and balances with everyone playing their part to make sure the process is fair and responsible.
That's right. And of course, the dean or medical superintendent, they're keeping a close eye on everything, making sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed.
They're the ultimate authority, right?
Exactly. They have to sign off on the specs and the cost estimates before anything can move forward. And everyone has to stick to those GEM rules and timelines. No exceptions.
So no cutting corners, no matter how tempting it might be. I also noticed they mentioned OPEX and CAPEX in the manual. What's that all about?
Ah, that's a good one. It's about how hospitals plan their budget for medical equipment. Sometimes it makes more sense to buy the equipment outright, which is called capital expenditure, or CAPEX. But other times they might choose to pay a recurring fee to use the equipment, which falls under operating expenditure, or OPEX.
So like a lease versus a buy situation.
Exactly. It all depends on the hospital's budget, the type of equipment, and how fast technology changes in that particular area.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want to buy a cutting-edge machine only to have it become obsolete in a year.
Exactly. Sometimes that OPEX model can be a smarter choice, especially for rapidly evolving technology.
So it's about thinking long-term and making the most strategic financial decision. Now, what about those situations where a hospital needs to buy something that's not on GEM? Maybe something super specialized or rare.
They've got rules for that too. If a purchase has to be made outside of GEM, they have to follow the General Financial Rules, the GFR. For tiny purchases under 25,000 rupees, they can just buy directly.
Like a quick run to the store for some bandages?
Pretty much. But for anything more than that, they need to get a purchase committee involved. And for larger purchases, they might use a limited tender inquiry where they invite bids from a select group of suppliers.
So a more exclusive bidding process?
Right. Or they could do an advertised tender inquiry where they announce the need publicly to get a wider range of bids. And for those really big or specialized purchases, they might even go global.
Wow, going international to find the perfect piece of equipment.
It happens. And they often use a two-bid system where companies submit separate bids for the technical stuff and the financial stuff.
So you evaluate the quality first and then look at the price.
Keeps things fair and transparent. And there are even rules for those really unique situations where a hospital needs something that's only made by one company.
Ah, so you're talking about those single source situations. Like, what are the options there?
Well, that's where the single tender inquiry comes in.
Yeah.
They can use that for those proprietary items where there's literally only one manufacturer, or in emergencies when they need something urgently and can't afford to shop around.
Makes sense. In a life or death situation, you got to get what you need fast.
Absolutely. But even then, they need a good justification and approval from the higher-ups. And there's this GFR Rule 173. It's all about keeping things transparent and fair.
Okay, tell me more about this transparency rule. How does it actually affect things?
Well, GFR Rule 173 basically says you got to do everything above board. No shady deals, no backroom handshakes. Everything has to be clear, competitive, and fair.
So everyone gets a fair shot, and the taxpayers can be confident that their money is being spent wisely.
Exactly. And the bidding documents, they have to be super detailed with all the information, timelines, evaluation criteria, the whole shebang. And they have to give those potential bidders enough time to put together their offers.
No last-minute surprises or rushed decisions?
Nope. And they open those bids publicly so everyone can see what's going on. And those technical specs, they have to be crystal clear so there's no room for ambiguity or misunderstanding.
No wiggle room for sneaky interpretations. I like it.
Yeah, it's all about keeping things clean. And they even encourage pre-bid conferences for those complex purchases so everyone can ask questions and get on the same page. And here's a big one, post-bid negotiations. They're a no-no.
So once the bids are in, That's it. No more haggling behind closed doors.
That's the idea. Keeps everything clean and transparent.
Okay, now let's talk about when a hospital is buying all this new equipment and they've got a bunch of old stuff they need to get rid of. What happens then?
Well, they can try to get a buyback offer from the company they're buying the new equipment from. Basically, they ask if the company wants to take the old stuff off their hands for a price.
So it's like a trade-in program for medical equipment.
Pretty much. It can be a win-win, especially if the old equipment still has some value, and it's a more environmentally responsible way to handle things too.
I like that. Less waste, everyone benefits. I also saw something about an integrity pact clause. What's that all about?
Ah, that's like a pinky swear, but with legal consequences.
Oh.
It's a formal agreement between the hospital and the companies bidding for the contract. Both sides promise not to do anything shady, like bribery or rigging the bids.
So it's like a pledge to play by the rules.
Exactly.
Right.
And they use this clause for those big purchases, where the temptation to cheat might be higher. It shows that everyone's committed to doing things ethically.
Okay, good to know. And then there were some mentions of force majeure and supporting small businesses. Can you explain that quickly?
Sure. Force majeure is like a legal safety net. It's for those act of God situations, like floods, earthquakes, things you can't control that might prevent someone from fulfilling their part of the contract. And as for supporting small businesses, they follow the government's policy of giving preference to small businesses when they're choosing suppliers.
So trying to give those smaller players a fair shot, that's good. And they're also big on the Make in India initiative, right?
Oh, yeah. They want to support Indian businesses and boost the local economy. And for companies from countries that share a border with India, there are some extra rules they have to follow.
Security concerns, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So they've got a lot of different factors they're juggling, all while trying to make sure they get the best equipment for their hospitals.
It's a lot to manage. So we followed this equipment from the initial, hey, we need a new machine, all the way to choosing the supplier. What happens next? How does the equipment actually get into the hospital and start working?
Well, once the supplier is chosen, they send a formal supply order. Then the equipment gets delivered to the hospital, and they do a thorough inspection to make sure it's exactly what they ordered.
So like checking your delivery against your online order, but for a $1 million machine.
Pretty much. And then the supplier has to install and set up the equipment. And the most important part, they have to train the hospital staff on how to use it.
You wouldn't want someone just winging it with a brand new MRI machine?
Definitely not. Once all that's done and everyone's happy, they issue a final acceptance certificate, or FAC, and then they create a consignee receipt cum acceptance certificate, or a CRAC.
So lots of paperwork to make everything official.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And usually the supplier has to provide something called a performance security. It's basically a financial guarantee that they'll meet their warranty obligations and all that.
So if something goes wrong, the hospital has some recourse.
Exactly. And then the payments are made, following the jam timelines, of course. And finally, they update their inventory system and the medical equipment dashboard with all the details of this new arrival.
So everyone knows what they have and where it is. Makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we've gotten the equipment into the hospital. Now, how do they make sure they know what they have and that it's actually being used?
That's where inventory management comes in. And one of our sources really stress how important this is. They have to keep track of everything they have, know what's being used and what's not, and get rid of anything that's outdated or just not needed anymore.
That sounds like a big job. Like, how do they actually manage all that?
Well, they've got systems for that. Some use fancy software or even RFID tags to track the location and status of each piece of equipment. And they set what they call PAR levels for essential items.
What's a PAR level?
It's like a minimum stock level. They make sure they always have enough of those critical items on hand without going overboard and overstocking. And they do regular physical audits where they actually go and count everything to make sure their records match reality.
So no relying on outdated spreadsheets or dusty filing cabinets?
Nope. And they talk to the doctors and nurses who actually use the equipment to get their input on what's needed and what's not.
So the people on the front lines have a voice in the process.
Exactly. And the ESIC manual, it really hammers home this point that keeping good records and managing your inventory is essential throughout the entire life of a piece of equipment.
From cradle to grave, basically. Makes sense. I also saw something about warranties, especially if the equipment isn't used right away. Why is that important?
Ah, good catch. Sometimes the warranty starts ticking as soon as the equipment arrives, or even earlier. But if a hospital isn't going to use it right away, they need to talk to the supplier and figure out a better start date for the warranty.
So They don't waste valuable warranty coverage while the machine is just sitting there.
Exactly. And it's important to make sure everything's documented properly so there are no arguments later on.
Yeah.
And they don't issue that final acceptance certificate until they've tested everything thoroughly.
So the warranty really starts when the equipment is actually being used. Smart move. Okay, now let's talk maintenance. How do they keep all this equipment running smoothly and prevent those mid-procedure breakdowns we talked about?
Equipment maintenance, it's a biggie. The ESIC manual breaks it down into 3 parts: inspection, preventive maintenance, and corrective maintenance.
Okay, break that down for me. What kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, a lot of it is basic stuff that the doctors and nurses can do themselves, like checking for damage, doing some basic tests, and cleaning the equipment according to the instructions.
So like routine checkups, but for machines.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And they have to report any issues to the maintenance team right away.
No, ignoring those warning signs.
Definitely not. Then there's preventive maintenance. This is the more specialized stuff that needs a trained technician.
So like getting your car serviced regularly to prevent major problems.
Exactly. And they do this based on the manufacturer's recommendations, even if the equipment isn't used that often. And in those critical care areas, like the ICU, they even suggest having backup machines ready to go just in case.
So there's always a plan B, because in those situations, every second counts.
Right. And then there's corrective maintenance, which is what they do when something actually breaks down. The goal is to get it fixed ASAP and minimize downtime.
Makes sense. You don't want a broken machine holding up patient care. So they've got a plan for every scenario. And to get a big picture view of how things are going, they also do these equipment audits, right?
Yes. Equipment audits are like taking inventory, but with a much deeper dive. They check every single piece of equipment to see if it's working, how often it's being used, and why it's not working if it's down.
So it's not just about knowing what they have, it's about understanding how well they're using what they have.
Exactly. And the E6 manual, it points out that a lot of equipment in hospitals can be non-functional at any given time.
Really? Why is that?
Well, sometimes it's a simple fix, like a minor repair or lack of maintenance. But sometimes it's more complicated, like missing spare parts or electrical problems. Or sometimes the equipment was bought without a real need, or they're not keeping track of how it's being used.
So it's a chance to identify those inefficiencies and waste.
Exactly. And when they do these audits, it leads to better use of the equipment, better patient care, and ultimately better use of resources.
So it's a win-win-win situation.
Pretty much. And they're supposed to do these audits every 6 months with a dedicated committee made up of people from different departments.
So it's a team effort with everyone bringing their expertise to the table. And what are they looking for specifically during these audits?
Well, they physically check every piece of equipment on their list to make sure it's actually there. And they check if it's working or not. And they analyze how much downtime each piece of equipment has had and why.
So getting to the root of the problem.
Right. And then they make recommendations, like maybe more training for staff or budgeting for repairs or even getting rid of equipment that's beyond repair. And they have to upload all this information to the equipment dashboard so everyone at ESIC headquarters can see what's going on.
So it's all about transparency and accountability and making sure everyone's on the same page and striving for improvement.
Exactly. And on top of those big audits, they also have this Hospital Medical Equipment Management Committee, which is focused on more day-to-day monitoring.
So it's like having a dedicated team keeping an eye on things all the time.
Right. This committee usually works at the department level, and they send in weekly reports on things like equipment that's not being used, equipment that's broken, and any urgent needs for supplies.
So they're constantly flagging any potential problems so they can be addressed quickly.
Exactly. They're like the early warning system, making sure things don't spiral out of control.
Oh.
They use checklists to keep track of key information, like when the last maintenance was done, how many hours the equipment has been used, and if there are any backup options available.
So it's a proactive approach, catching issues before they become major headaches.
Exactly. And all this information they gather, it helps them make better decisions when it comes to those bigger biannual audits.
So it's all connected. The daily vigilance feeds into the bigger picture. Okay, now let's talk about the inevitable when equipment reaches the end of its life. How do they decide when it's time to say goodbye?
The ESIC manual has very specific rules about when to condemn medical equipment. There are a bunch of reasons why a piece of equipment might be on the chopping block.
Like what?
Well, if it's just too expensive to repair, or they can't get spare parts anymore, or the technology is outdated, or maybe the manufacturer has said it's reached the end of its life. Or maybe the running costs are just through the roof.
So it's not just about how old it is, but also about its overall condition and cost effectiveness.
Right. And if it's a safety hazard, that's a big red flag too. They've got specific criteria for all these situations, so the decision-making process is clear and objective.
So no one's keeping a beloved but clunky machine running just because they're attached to it.
Nope, sentimentality doesn't fly when it comes to patient safety.
So who actually makes the call on whether to condemn a piece of equipment?
They have a condemnation committee for that, and the makeup of this committee depends on how much the equipment originally cost.
So the bigger the price tag, the more serious the decision-making process.
Exactly. For expensive equipment, they might even bring in specialists from other hospitals or outside experts to get their opinions. And for those really big ticket items, anything over 2 crore rupees.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, for those, they send the proposal all the way up to ESIC headquarters.
So the higher-ups get involved when the stakes are high. Makes sense. And what does this committee actually do? What's their process?
They basically investigate the equipment in question, looking at all the relevant factors. Then they make a recommendation on whether to condemn it.
So they're like the jury in a medical equipment trial.
You could say that, but their verdict isn't the final word. The hospital administration has to approve it, usually in consultation with the finance department.
So multiple layers of approval to make sure the decision is sound.
Exactly. And once the equipment is officially condemned, they have to figure out how to dispose of it.
Right, because you can't just toss a giant x-ray machine in the dumpster.
Definitely not. They have to follow GFR Rule 217, which outlines the disposal procedures. There are a few different options.
Like what?
Well, sometimes they can get the company they're buying the new equipment from to take the old stuff back. Or they might sell it to a scrap dealer or another organization that can use it.
So giving it a second life, if possible.
Right. And sometimes they just have to destroy it and dispose of it locally, following all the environmental regulations, of course. Or they can hold a public auction.
So someone might score a bargain on a slightly used ultrasound machine.
You never know. And if it's hazardous equipment, they have to follow even stricter rules for disposal.
Makes sense. Got to protect public health and the environment.
Absolutely. And they have to keep track of all the financial stuff, too, like depreciation and any losses due to damage or theft. And they need proper authorization to write off those losses.
So it's a very structured and accountable process with a lot of paperwork involved.
Oh, yeah, lots of paperwork. And if they're selling the equipment through a tender or auction, they have to make sure everything is transparent and fair with clear rules and public notices.
So no under-the-table deals or favoritism?
Nope. It's all about doing things by the book.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about data privacy. I know this is a big deal in healthcare these days. How does it relate to medical equipment?
Yeah, data privacy is huge. These days, medical equipment is getting smarter and more connected, which means it can collect and store a lot of patient data.
Which is sensitive information that needs to be protected.
Exactly. The ESIC manual is very clear about this. They don't want any patient data being shared with the equipment manufacturers, suppliers, or vendors.
So no backdoor access to confidential information.
Nope. And they even make the bidding companies sign non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, to protect that data. And they stress that everyone involved needs to follow strict procedures to keep patient information confidential.
So it's a top priority.
It has to be. And ideally, they want equipment that can connect directly to their own secure online systems so they can avoid sharing data externally as much as possible.
So keeping that sensitive information within their own secure bubble.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing the risk of breaches and protecting patient privacy.
Okay, now let's talk about something that's always a concern, making the most of what you have. I know there are often issues with equipment sitting unused or underutilized in hospitals. Why does that happen?
Yeah, it's a common problem. Sometimes they buy a fancy new machine, but then they don't have enough trained staff to operate it.
So it's like having a Ferrari but no one who can drive it.
Pretty much. Or maybe they don't have the space for it, or the electrical system can't handle it. Or maybe they just didn't think through all the logistical details before making the purchase.
So it's a case of getting ahead of themselves and not planning properly.
That's often the case. The ESIC manual really emphasizes the importance of planning before buying anything. They need to make sure they have the right staff, the space, the infrastructure, the certifications, everything.
So it's like a pre-flight checklist, but for medical equipment.
Exactly. They have to think through all the potential roadblocks and make sure everything's in place before they hit the